What's up, GTM News listeners? Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. I'm actually pulling a conversation that I recently did on another podcast, the GTM Cheat Code Podcast. And it was a great conversation. Their season is all around partnerships, strategic partnerships. So I went on and talked about what I've seen work in early stage B2B companies around strategic partnerships and co-marketing, co-selling, co-integrations, ecosystem marketing. We even talk about co-opetition, which is another form of partnerships and going to market together. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I've seen what works and what doesn't work, especially in early stage companies. And partnerships are all the hype right now, which I can see why, and they're an awesome way to go to market. But I also have some reservations and some hot takes on the topic. So let's jump right into my conversation on the GTM News show. And once again, for future reference, we'll be having more of these conversations where I go on other podcasts, talk about different topics around GTM and really early stage growth at B2B companies. Thanks for listening.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the GTM Cheat Code. This is Josh Wagner, joined with Justin Gray. Justin, what's happening?
Same old shit.
Good to be back with you. I know Sean filled in for me last week, so we've got it was
the best episode ever, by the way.
Yeah, so anytime I'm not involved,
Sean's going to be my co-host.
You guys just crush, so I get it. Totally good. Well, super excited to jump in here with everybody and introduce today's guest, who has worked in many bootstrap B2B startups and VC-backed companies, starting in sales roles and moving into marketing roles. He's on a mission to make sure every B2B marketing and sales interaction provides impact outside of just product. He's the host and founder of GTM.news and a fractional head of demand generation at wherever you want him to be. Please welcome Taylor Wells to the show. Taylor, welcome.
Hey, Josh. Hey, Justin. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, man, we're super excited to have you. And I know I was on your show. How long has it been now?
Almost a year. It's been a minute.
I want to say it was like episode 1 or 2. It was pretty early on.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Oh, wow.
I think it was, a third or fourth episode. And it was a great conversation. Glad to chat again.
I'm sure the metrics
and people dialed in for future episodes after having Josh on. That's crazy.
I'm on your show. I want to make you look good. So, I'll skip those details. Yeah. No, just joking. It was great. Yeah, it was a great topic. I think it was around selling and really just, I think it was hate selling but love the game. Something like
selling,
that.
Hate sales was one of my former shows. Yeah,
I loved it. It was great.
So I'm sure you hockey sticked a few episodes after I was on. So good to know. Well, anyway, we like to jump right into it here. And, this episode of this season is all about partnerships. So we want to hear directly from you. What is your ultimate partnership cheat code?
Yeah, great question. And I definitely, as you kind of mentioned earlier, context for the audience, worked in a lot of bootstrap small organizations. They didn't have huge partnership teams, and really looking at, how to get started with it. And you mentioned earlier about impact, and there's one other area, and we can talk about these two concepts as we could talk about partnerships and partnership-led growth. But really, I think about impact and relationships, and those are the two ways to go to market efficiently. And partnerships happen to be definitely relationships, and you can also provide additional impact outside of kind of pre-customer. But to answer your question with that context, there's really two areas I wanted to focus on. Number one is actually a reality check, especially for early stage companies. And kind of my cheat code is number one within that reality check is, unless you create a product that's specifically designed to go through a partnership motion, it's gonna be really challenging. And I don't think it should be a large portion of your pipeline. I don't think you should necessarily, especially like 0 to 5 million. So give you an example. If it is a product, if you design the product to go to market through partnership, that could be through integrations, number one, right? That could be through ecosystems, right? Tapping into a pre-established ecosystem. And I have like 8 different partnership opportunities you can look at. We can talk about those 8 different ones. 2 of those are ecosystem and integration. So the reality check is, unless you build a product first to go, partnerships are really hard. And there's ways you can still use partnerships in early stage companies, which we can talk about today. But the part two of ultimately my cheat code is focusing on a value add for the customer. So I know everyone says solve for the customer, and I'm going to use that phrase again. But a lot of times partnerships, we look at it as like, hey, what can I give the partnership? And it's like a lot of times early stage companies, it's like referral programs or, how do I get them some sort of compensation? And actually what I've found is one of the most powerful ways is just figuring out how you can be, a 1 + 1 = 3 for the customer. How can you provide extra value? And sometimes your partner, they won't want referrals back. They don't necessarily want referrals. They won't necessarily want money. They just want you to help their customers be a value add for their customers. And so we can kind of dig into that today. So 2 cheat codes to kind of rehash. Number 1, reality check. If you don't design your product first to go to market through partnerships, it's going to be really hard. For the rest of us mere mortals, I may be a service business or your product is maybe an enterprise offering that integrations and or an ecosystem isn't the right motion. And the other side of that is really focused on how do you just provide extra value for that end customer. And sometimes those referral partners, the strategic partners, they don't want anything in return. They just want you to provide more value for your customer, be a good referral partner, right? And I've found that time and time again in my career, which has always surprised me. Or like, I don't want anything in return. Just make sure you solve this problem for my customer.
Yeah, I think the customer value, I don't want to not put importance on it because I think it's wildly important and needs to be the number one thing. But I do want to start with the reality check because I think it's a hard line stance that you're willing to take that not a lot of others are. So talk to us about that, right? Like
Sure.
Producing your product, your service, whatever, with partnerships in mind. I don't think people think that way. So how do you reframe yourself to think that way?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And there's a lot. First, I'm not product, I come from a product world by nature. So this is something I constantly have to be learning about, right? So working with product people, engineers, whoever creates your product, I think, tapping into that world and understand that world better is always super important, especially from go to market, right? As long as the more you can partner, the better. Maybe I'll rehash real quick the 8 different areas that I think about partnerships, if that's cool. And that kind of helped me answer kind of the different buckets. So the 8 different ways, and hopefully I answer your question here quickly. There's kind of 8 ways I've identified you can partner. There's actually more, but those are outside of the strategic partnerships, and maybe we can touch on those today too. First, there's co-learning. So a simple way to start building strategic partnerships is through co-learning. So that means just networking, building relationships, understanding your ICP better with other folks in the industry that have a similar ICP, that have a similar ideal customer, have a complementary product. Just learn, network them, right? And I've some of my closest relationships over the years have been strategic partnerships I formed, and I kept those relationships. And we continue to network. Even though we're in completely different industries now, but it's fascinating. You've learned so much that you can just co-learn together. Number 2 is co-marketing. And actually I stack these from the easiest to the hardest. So the easiest to get into is co-learning, right? The next one is co-marketing. Simple things like what we're doing right now. We're co-marketing together, right? We're both creating content together. You're gonna get me exposure to your market for my purposes. Vice versa, I'm gonna help you promote this podcast. Co-selling, right? That's kind of the next level of how do you your sales teams or you co-sell an offering together. Channel, master agents. I work a lot in the cybersecurity space, IT space, so channel partnership is huge in that space of basically having resellers, value add, resellers, integrators, consultants. It's a huge, it's like 80% of the enterprise cybersecurity and IT offerings go through a channel motion. Great opportunity there. Next one is integrations. So your product integrates. Next one's building an ecosystem. HubSpot's, great example of this. AWS, Microsoft ecosystem, Shopify, right? And then the next area would be tapping into an ecosystem. So like Klaviyo and Shopify, right? Klaviyo built a marketing tools for the Shopify ecosystem. And now, they just recently went public a couple months ago. Last but not least is co-opetition, which I don't know if you guys have talked about this concept on this show, something I learned about a year ago. And from a behavioral economics professor, I read a couple of his books, and he talks a lot about competition. Competition. Are you guys familiar with this topic, this idea?
Not me.
Super fascinating.
I am, but we haven't talked about it on the show, so it'd be great to dive in a little bit deeper there.
Cool. And I promise I'll get back to your question, Josh. But as you can tell, I'm really passionate about these.
Questions don't matter. It's the conversation that matters.
Sweet. So competition is just not a fancy way. It's actually kind of a weird word combination of competition and cooperation, and they smash those two words together, and it is fascinating. Go look up competition, and almost every single Fortune 500 company does this. So, like for example, Apple uses Samsung products in their phones. Who's one of their major competitors? Samsung, right? So they're using each other's tools. Netflix uses AWS to host their all their servers, right? AWS is owned by Amazon. Amazon owns Amazon Prime, direct competitors. The other one too, and I saw Singram was on your, I think last season, Singram, founder of Terminus. He does a great example of from a marketing standpoint. So all the other examples I talked about is product, right? From competition. From a marketing standpoint, Singram with Terminus, ABM, account-based marketing pioneers. He did the first conference, ABM conference, and guess what he did? He invited all of his competitors.
Competition.
6 Sense, demand-based, right? And a really clever way to educate the market, really clever way to build relationships even with your competition. So these are like the whole like, slew of opportunities for strategic partnerships. The first two are the easiest to do, especially at early stage companies, right? Co-learning and co-marketing. All the other ones take a lot of work and a lot of investment. So to answer your question, Josh, unless you structure your product, right? So unless you build a product in mind for an ecosystem, right? Like AWS, or you build it for the Microsoft ecosystem or Shopify or whatever, which is a great way to go to market, right? Phenomenal. You can leverage those. It's like, tremendous marketing. You still have competition. You still have your own ways. I'm honestly not an expert on ecosystem marketing or even integrations, which is the other part of it, of how do you build a product that integrates with a bunch of other products, right? But then provides a better value for the customer. So those, unless you're doing those two things, I think partnerships are to make a huge investment at an early stage. Because the problem with what I found is, and the reason why I say the caution, right, for the cheat code is you're going to get diluted. Your marketing efforts are going to dilute it because to do all the other ones, co-selling, channel, and building an ecosystem, all those other ones, you still need to do marketing. You still need to have a sales team. You still need to do kind of inbound, outbound. You still need to have a lot of the kind of foundations of go-to-market. Because if you don't, your co-selling is not going to be great. If you don't have the foundations of marketing, your co-marketing is not going to be great. So I think a lot of times executives, leaders, CEOs, and right now it's like, I can see why you guys are doing this series around partnership because it's awesome, because it's all the rage right now, right? Everyone's talking about it. Every time I open my inbox, it seems like somebody's talking about partnerships. And I agree. It's a great opportunity. Going back to my principles, right? Like either provide impact or you go through relationships, and partnerships is that part of relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, the interesting in this, strangely, every time we talk about a subject on this show, it seems like we just had a real world conversation about this, like either earlier in the day or very, near in proximity. And like the main thing I'm taking away from this is like, none of these aspects are like bolt-ons. And it's so funny how, organizations think about even fundamentals like marketing as a bolt-on, right? Like, this go-to-market strategy that they're going to go into a closet and come out with and say like, hey, marketing's put together this great go-to-market strategy. Like that, everything has to be a holistic, and I hate to use the word planning because it sounds so boring and lame, but like when you're thinking about commercializing something or even building something for the first time, like you have to consider these different elements, right? And the interesting thing was I was having a conversation with a founder earlier today, and, very typical story. I won't even bore you guys with it, but like the place that they're at is like their marketing and their message to partners and even their fundamental sales messaging, like it's just like very boring. It's very dry. It's, spoken through the lens of, folks internal to that organization. And we're trying to get them to latch onto a next step to get out of this terrible stale place. And so we started talking about the job to be done. Have you guys ever seen that framework before? Like fundamentally, like, it's great. Everyone wants to talk in like use cases or value props and so on, but like fundamentally, like what is that person struggling with on a day-to-day basis? That's their job to be done, right? Like I probably just want someone to stop calling me and asking me this problem, and therefore like how does the solution alleviate that pain? But when we started describing this to this founder, he's like, oh yeah, our product team does that. When they're organizing sprints and things like that, they actually organize everything around this concept of job to be done. And we're like, dude, great. Like, it sounds like you've done, at least some of the work to be done here, right? Like, still need market validation, but like, why does that not get carried forward into the go-to-market plan for the organization, to the annual plan for that organization, to the marketing messaging, so on and so forth? So I'm curious, Taylor, like, how did you kind of come about? Because it sounds like you very much have a framework for this, right? Like, how did you come about the need for this and kind of the desire to like bring people back to these foundational aspects?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's survival. That's what brought me back to it. I think really like in the small businesses, you have to think outside of the box, right? Either bootstrap companies or lightly funded. The VC-backed companies was a little bit different. You can just hire a big team, right, to try to solve one of these problems, and your efficiency in that go-to-market motion doesn't have to be as great. But I think to answer your question, how I've gotten back to these principles was like always having to think outside the box, right? I think partnerships are a phenomenal opportunity to do that. You can create something that is really a differentiator, right? If you can create a partnership, whether it's even co-marketing or co-learning, it's a differentiator in your market, right? You can level up your competitors. So I think from my perspective, it's always having been like, how do we reduce our CAC? How do we reduce how do we get a flow of good leads? How do we, when we don't have huge marketing budgets, right? And so I think that's where partnerships, my drive for that has been in. And what's cool is even in a smaller organization, you can really find, I'm constantly trying to challenge myself. How can I bring a partner in on this? Right. And because I think you can go a little bit further, a little bit farther. Your cost of marketing, your cost of sales, whatever it is, gets reduced a little bit more. And so, and then how can you, ultimately create that 1 + 1 = 3, which is really the beauty of it. And going back to what kind of what I said about, I think in my intro, Josh, what you mentioned as far as creating great buyers experiences, that's what the buyers want, right? Buyers want to learn about things through folks that already trust, right? And so, they want to learn about it from their peers. They want to learn about it from your customers. They want to learn about it from influencers and industry leaders. They want to learn about it from the people they're already buying products from. And so I think that's what also drove me too, is like a combination of, hey, I need to find efficient ways to go to market. And then number two is I noticed buyers really like it, right? Like your close, like when you have a partner lead referral, your close ratio is just way higher, right? Whether it's from a customer or from a strategic partner, right? You're when I was in AE, it was like 50%, 60%, 70% close ratios versus, the industry standard 30 or 40% at my best. So yeah, those are kind of two things that stick out to me.
Yeah. What I find fascinating is you listed off 8 different types of partnerships. And I think in mine and Justin's frameworks, we have 4. Doesn't really matter. But most early stage founders immediately gravitate towards the middle, which is that reseller. Like, oh, listen, someone's going to sell it for me. I don't have to do anything. It's just this magic button of someone selling my stuff and all I got to do is pay them a fee, right? And not recognizing what you defined on the top end of these are relatively easy motions, co-marketing, co-learning and whatnot. And very, very difficult motions down at the other end with the co-opetition and joint go-to-market and things like that. So you're recognizing that it's hard, right? And I think a lot of people don't recognize it, that it's hard, but you're also recognizing that resell motion is fairly sophisticated and hard in itself. And that cyber world that maybe I've got some experience there as well. How do you get founders thinking about the customer first? Because that's what you said, impact, customer. That's where partnerships really make a change. How do you get that switch from lead easy to customer impact as the first lever you should be thinking about?
Cool. Do you mind if I ask you a question actually, real quick? Is that cool?
Go for it.
Sweet. How has that worked out for the founders you've worked with that kind of go in towards the middle of like the reseller motion?
Oh, it never works because it's so much harder than they even think. They just think we do a webinar and we show them some stuff and their army of salespeople are going to go out and sell it. What they don't know that it's deep embedded relationships with those sellers. It's constant education. It's training. It's enablement. It's a full enablement team that needs to be put behind enabling a reseller to go sell your stuff. That's why it's more sophisticated and more challenging. And the really good ones half the time go buy books of business from people who have sold through resellers for 20, 30 years who have those relationships. You mentioned relationships earlier. That's what it is. It's not easy, but it's a perception.
Yeah. I'd say without fail, like folks that have tried, if let's say we're getting into an investment, like most of our portcos and CEOs will immediately say like, yeah, we've tried the partnership thing already. And, it never went anywhere. And, kind of to your point, like the next question is always like, all right, like what have you done, that is creative, that stands out? Like, how'd you approach that partnership? And it's always like, well, we went right through their process. We did everything they asked us to, in their partner kind of playbook. And it's like our first piece of advice is like, well, that's what we're going to try to do the opposite of in everything. Like we're going to try to break that mold and get access to actual relationships. Because I find that most enterprise partner programs are actually created at the expense of relationship in order to avoid direct contact with people that they view that are doing a high value activity. No, they should be selling. We're not going to give all these partners access to them because they're just going to, totally evaporate their time. And so I think that's how partnerships are designed. And in order to be successful, you have to kind of break through that smoke screen.
Thanks for sharing. I love it. That's helpful. And couldn't agree more. I think there's, that's interesting. You mentioned like the going outside the mold and doing something new. And I think to answer your question, Josh, as far as what's worked, or thinking about, because everyone goes for that, right? It's like, how can I pay you to give me a lead? And I think if you really think about it from their perspective, right, use a little empathy, and they're putting their reputation on the line, right? They're putting their entire business, that entire customer relationship on the line for some extra money. Like, and that's this. I mean, to trivialize that, the importance of reputation is just, I think, super, super foolish, and kind of insulting to think you can just pay somebody. Maybe that works for like 10% of the market, right? So like cheap affiliates. And if you're like maybe in B2C and you're looking for, I don't want to diminish anybody, but maybe if you're looking for folks that are doing affiliate programs or whatever, maybe that works for that segment of the market. But when you're looking at, especially enterprise, relationships, everything, trust is everything. And when you have a really small market, really big deal sizes, no one really cares about your affiliate money or your referral fee or whatever. And I kind of go back to even like in the early days of my career. I think through a couple stories come to mind. Number one, I was working for an IT service provider, and I think I'm trying to remember how I actually got introduced to this, but I think I was actually marketing to them, and it was a marketing agency, and I was like, marketing our service to them, selling our service to them. They're like, hey, we don't need this, but actually our customers need your solution. And it ended up, we built a relationship with them. We sent them some referrals, but mostly it was crazy. They sent us constantly. Once we built trust, right? It took time. Once we built trust and we delivered and even if it didn't turn to a customer, right? We spent time with the people that they sent. We helped them solve a couple problems. We're really value add in the sales consultation. We overgave. We made them look great. We, fix small problems in their IT infrastructure, whatever it is. We just overgave and to them to make them look good and really respect the relationship. And it was crazy how many referrals they sent us. They didn't want any money. They didn't care about the money. They didn't want a referral fee. They didn't even want referrals back from us. Like they were happy for it. But, it was like they were primarily driven by their customer had a problem and we could solve it. And once we built trust with them, we built, earned the opportunity for them to send us referrals. And so I think to kind of go even one step deeper into your question is how do you build that trust with them, right? So an analogy I use is we talk about sales cycle, right? Everyone knows what a sales cycle is. Marketing cycle actually isn't talked about very much, but if you think about your sales cycle, my anecdotal research and my own experience could be like your marketing cycle could be 2, 3, 4 times longer than your sales cycle. And then actually what's further than that is your marketing cycle, or excuse me, your partnership cycle. So your partnership cycle, you're selling to 2 people. Now you're selling to your partner, right? And then you're also selling to their end consumer. And so they have to be bought in on it. You have to provide that value. And it's interesting, like, if you're in SMB space, it's a little bit easier to build partnerships. I think the trust can be delivered faster. But when I worked for a high growth venture backed company, and we were building relationships with Fortune 500 companies, and I won't drop any names, but it was like probably the most frustrating experience I've ever been in, just because building that relationship was so hard. Like, there was just so many levels of people you had to go through. Think about selling to a Fortune 500 company is one thing. Partnering with a Fortune 500 company is like literally 2 or 3 times harder, as it should be, right? Because you're getting access to their customers. They're putting their reputation on the line. There's a legal requirement. It's not only that you're selling to them and you're a product inside their organization, but you're either using their name or there's some sort of co-marketing. And so as I kind of going back, like how to get started with all that is really how do you ultimately build that trust with that partner as quickly as possible. You can start out with that co-learning, right? Where you're just building a relationship with them. That co-marketing, I think, especially for early stage, if you don't have a partnership team, if you don't have like a dedicated person doing it, or unless your CEO or executive is like, they're building the product, like I mentioned earlier, for the ecosystem, for integrations, or they just have like tons of relationships with, maybe they've been in the industry for 15, 20 years and they worked at other companies and they can build those partnerships really, really well. If you're just like, partnerships usually gets thrown in the lap of some salesperson or some marketing person is what I found. Maybe sometimes product, but usually, what I've seen, it gets thrown in the lap of like, hey, let's do this. And I think to your point, why it fails so much in the past is that there's just not enough time spent on it. So start out with the co-learning, start out with those co-marketing. Like, it's amazing how quickly you can go to market and start building that relationship with the co-marketing. And happy to talk more about specifics on that too.
Well, in terms of specifics, I'm curious, like what you found as just like radical results with this approach, right? Like if you're able to get people to think about that customer value, if you're able to, align that with product and really make that a fundamental aspect, like what have you seen, these types of programs and ecosystems produce?
Yeah. So I think once again, maybe I probably don't have the best answer for you because, I'm not Klaviyo, or I study a lot of the big companies. If you want to look at like crazy ecosystem, or some sort of strategic partnership, I recommend looking at those companies and seeing how they've been built around that. For me personally, it's really been like 20 or 30% of our pipeline comes from partnerships. And that's awesome because the cost of that is almost zero. So it like brings our overall CAC to like, much, as much as outbound or inbound or, all the other strategies. But I think what's cool is like, once you invest, it's like, it's front end and it takes time, right? There's that longevity, there's that, or not longevity, but there's that time delay that's required. But once you invest it on the front end, it's like I mentioned, 2 biggest things. First, the cost of customer acquisition, at least from the marketing side, you still have your sales costs and whatnot, goes to zero, right? Because you're just getting those leads. You're just maybe doing those partnership programs. And then the other part of it would be, just obviously the improvement in like double the conversion rates when they're in the pipeline. Probably the other examples too have been pretty cool have been even so like from maybe the channel side, not so much going to market through a channel. So channel marketing or channel sales, if everyone's not familiar with it, is it's crazy world, but essentially, people are reselling your product. It's not so much like a referral basis or even a co-selling basis. It's more, it's integrated into their product stack, right? They're reselling it. In the cybersecurity IT space, it could be like an MSP selling a software solution or whatnot. What was cool in that space was, you can partner with other companies, and a lot of times they'll give you money to do the marketing, right? It's called MDF, marketing development funds. that was really cool. Where I was like, oh my gosh, like, I was like, they'll literally give us money to go to market together. And we're already positioning their product. A lot of times they'll even bring in expertise, right? So I think that's probably the biggest thing I've experienced. And then in marketing in general, the co-marketing is where I found the most success across the board. And maybe it's because I've realized that, just the co-selling integrations are really challenging unless you have a focus there, a heavy focus in there. The co-marketing is where it's been, phenomenal. Where once again, you're like, your reach is just way more greater. You have that joint efforts. I don't have any stats off the top of my head, but it's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, 30% of pipeline at a net zero lead acquisition cost is certainly nothing to shake a stick at. And I think if organizations can take a look at where they're at currently in terms of sales performance, and then being able to increase that by 25-30%, I mean, like that's manna from heaven right there. So certainly I think Speaks is a great example of what these types of programs can kick off.
What do you think is the future of that traditional resale channel? Where you've got your value-added resellers and, folks that are operating on relatively razor-thin margins and are essentially going to sell whoever provides them with the best margin, right? Yeah. Are their relationships with the customer so valuable that someone couldn't unseat that?
Good question. Yeah, and that's a great question. I think in general, well, first of all, I think there's a kind of an interesting future with service providers, and this might be answering your question, it might not be, but I've been thinking a lot about this with AI and software in general. Like, I think software is only becoming more commoditized. There's so much competition, and the service provider is, I think, in a stronger position they've ever been. And I think the future is actually going to look really, really bright for service providers, even though we've been in this, like, SaaS is king or queen for the past, 20 years or whatever, 15 years really. But so, I think there's an element where the relationship is actually even more, to answer your question, is going to be even more powerful. And, I think if you can provide value in being creative, once again, if you can get creative, you can, over innovate. I was actually just reading this book. I think it's called Focus. It's a marketing book. And they talk about kind of the two ways, businesses are broken down into two areas: marketing and innovation. And so, if you look like Elon Musk, great example of this. One of the greatest innovators of ever, right? And he's also a phenomenal marketer. He literally bought a social media platform. And so I think about, to answer your question, like, yes, either you can out market in sort of, but it's really hard to, upset those relationships. And so I think that service provider is only going to get stronger as they continue to maintain relationships. But if you can out innovate, right? If you can make your product better, and if you can create an offering, that's what's really, I think, partnerships. Like, I know I've been kind of, talking, being realistic about them, especially for early stage companies. There's obviously definitely elements of it that are really bright. I do think it's like worthwhile for the long term, right? If you're trying to build a great company over many years, but every early stage company is ultimately trying to, they're burning on fumes usually, especially in this environment. And they're looking a quarter out or a couple quarters out, whereas partnerships are really more of a long-term play. Outside of the co-marketing and maybe some co-selling or like referral partners and stuff like that, you can get kind of short-term wins. But to answer your questions, I think, the future is bright for service providers, the ones that hold relationships. But if you can out-innovate, if you can create an offering that's just like, oh my gosh, no one else has this, and you're able to solve more problems between your partners, right? It gets really fun because you actually get like, oh man, we're actually creating a product, the end product, right? That's like going back to what I said at the very beginning. The end product has to be better for the end consumer, because no partner's going to care about referrals. No partners really even care about leads or even stuff like that. I think those things are great, but that's easily taken away from in the sense of there's lots of ways to get those things. It's really hard to create a better product for a customer. So I don't know if that answers your question, Josh.
Well, I think you hit on something that's so one first point, I 1000% agree, but I think you hit on something really important in terms of the why there, which is access to the problem. which service providers often have in spades, especially consultancies and advisors, people that have established that strategic advisor relationship. Whereas a lot of SaaS, although it has been the darling of the last 2 decades, normally gets access to like one of the acute pains down the line. Like someone says like, oh, we've got this problem, we're going to go buy, or this pain, we're going to go buy software to alleviate that. But rarely do they go to a software provider and say, hey, here's our problem, what do you recommend? Which is what happens every single day in services-based businesses, right? Like, hey, we're trying to, change market perception. We're trying to launch this new product. Like, help us put together a comprehensive strategy. Like, that's the problem. That's the disease at the root. Whereas there's so much self-prescription that happens as, prior to a software purchase that, if someone else comes out with innovation, even if you're on a platform, I think, probably 10 years ago, we would have said like, no one unseats Salesforce. Like, with AI, there's a real opportunity to unseat like a lot of these really fundamental platforms because, it's like when your grandma buys an iPhone, like you can't help but adopt what is that thing that's 10 times better because the old thing is, no one buys, a flip phone or whatever it is these days. So I think that's a super important aspect because of that access and the relationship that comes from like consistently solving for those fundamental problems.
Yeah, completely agreed. I think there's an element too, you're making me kind of think about even just go to market in general. And I think the last SaaS has ruined go to market in the sense of like, growth at all costs. Let's just churn them, burn them. Let's cram them through our sales process. And it's created horrible experiences. It's built in very little relationship, right? It's transactional. It's like, it's all those things that are antithetical to partnerships, antithetical to building relationships, antithetical to creating great buyer's experience. And so with AI, every SaaS platform is going to be threatened for that, number one. And then number two, even back to like the impact, I think AI is going to have this fascinating effect of we're going to trust everything less, right? We're going to trust like the internet less, in my opinion. We're going to trust content, marketing, everything less. Because we're going to have a hard time knowing what's real and what's not real. And so we're going to go back to relationships, right? Like I worked, one of my first jobs, I worked for my father, who was a financial advisor. And I learned a lot from him just watching how he treated his customers, right? And he had a fiduciary obligation to do what was in the best interest of them. And I've literally never heard that word fiduciary once in the SaaS world because our goal is to ultimately get closed won. And ultimately drive more revenue. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I think the folks that win, like whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, customer success, I have this concept, which maybe someday I'll write a book on it, called the selfless advantage. And it really is talks about like, hey, how do you create great buyers experiences? How do you create, and I think you said in the intro, how do you create value pre-customer? And that's through impact, right? And even the product-led growth world is a perfect example of impact, right? Their time to value is super fast. They're giving impact through a free trial or even just super fast, right? Thought leadership is another way to provide impact. Sales consultation, right? Providing value in that, where they're like, man, I want to talk to this guy again or this gal again because they're providing so much value in this conversation. And the other half of that is relationships, right? Which we've talked a lot about today is partnerships. And relationships are not even so early stage, right? Early relationships are not just partnerships. It could be with your customers. It could be in community. And that's another thing I advise to people too. Is like, hey, partnerships are really exciting. And I completely agree. But if you're not leveraging your customers, or if you're not investing in community-led growth, I think those things are low-hanging fruit that you're going to get way more impact faster than you will a partnership. And you can use them all together too. Like once you've leveraged them all and used them all really well together, which gets really fun. So I think once again, looking back at how do we create amazing experiences? Because I think even salespeople, like even go-to-market teams, they're going to get it's going to get even more commoditized. I think with AI, it's going to get replaceable. Those folks that can create a better buying experience and a product that's 1 + 1 = 3. Those are the folks I think are going to win.
Well, you've already seen that trust in terms of like what we, how we trust information. Like you've already seen that, like this whole advent of 80% of the buying process happens online, which I think was probably applicable to like 15 years ago, where we would go online and trust whatever we found there. Like people have have learned that information is like vendor serving at this point. So, and which is a point in our forthcoming book that like, I think you're starting to see already, like decision-making processes really kind of rewind and harken back to, yeah, I can see what information's out there, but at the end of the day, I'm going to call folks I trust, tap into their experience and use that to inform my decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. What's your new book? The Cheat Code. Right on. Could have guessed that.
Coming out later on this year.
Absolutely.
I'll look for that.
Yeah. So Taylor, to kind of wrap a bow around all of this, I think starting at the top, customer impact is where we have to start if we want to think about partnerships, right? Like there is no partnership without a joint impact on the customer. Understanding what that is relies on relationships. We have to have relationships in order to get a deep insight into the customer, what it is they're doing. And if you're a startup, you shouldn't really be thinking about much more than the first three, the co-learning, co-marketing, and maybe dipping your toe into co-selling, unless you tailor built your product to go into 4 through 8. Is that kind of how you would summarize it?
I love it. Couldn't have said it better myself. Maybe we should just start that at the beginning of the podcast so people can skip the rest of the conversation.
I'm a great summarizer.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. One thing I will add too, like if you want to get started with figuring out like who to partner with and whatnot, ask your customers. Like ask your customers, like, what other service providers do you use? What other technology do you use? If you have a software platform, you potentially have that data, right? Where you can look and see like what other tools they're integrating with. That can help you prioritize what a list are. If you don't have that data, just ask them, right? And I think if you're really ingrained in your industry, you can obviously see them very quickly, who's advertising, who's at the trade shows, who's marketing to the same ICP. But I think, asking your customers can be a great way to get started, or looking at your product. And I love it. I think you did a great job summarizing and ultimately figuring out how you can provide more value and build those relationships. And just get started with something small, like just get that relationship started, right? Either co-learning or do a webinar together. I will say, like, give first, right? Like, this is a good example just in general from go-to-market. But if you can, give them a referral first. If you want referrals, give them a referral first. If you want to do a webinar, you host the webinar. You do all the work. You bring them on. You make them look great. If you want to do a joint ebook or joint marketing, you create the ebook and offer to put it in front of their audience, right? And I think that give first goes a tremendous long way. And I think you even said it earlier, Josh, of like, they just want a kind of a quick win, and relationships don't work like that, right? And you're asking a lot to build that trust. And so give first, and and the big mistake I've made too in the past is like, I wasn't consistent too. Like I gave and then they start a partnership, and nothing happens for 6 months, or you don't keep the ball rolling. I think that intentionality of like being consistent, showing up, and then being it for the long haul will really create that reciprocity, and ultimately folks will reciprocate. And
Well, Taylor, I'd like to give you the opportunity to promote whatever it is you want to promote, whether it be yourself or one of your businesses. You have the floor.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I was about to make a joke of like, hey, send me referrals. No, I won't do that. But
I offer 10% commissions.
Yeah. Lifetime
$25 Starbucks gift card.
Yeah, lifetime. Buy my I'll do referrals for my course, my $5,000 course. No, I'm joking.
That's right.
Thanks for asking. So I do demand gen, go to market for early stage companies. So folks that are like kind of stuck. A lot of them are like around that $1 million range in revenue, and they're kind of stuck. Maybe they've had junior marketers or junior sellers on their team, and they feel like they're not growing well. I kind of come in, provide a lot of strategy, but I also execute. So I get in the weeds and help them with a lot of the partnerships we talked about. And even with my current clients, we're like, I'm helping them try to figure out like how to do co-marketing or how to help them with their channel program. So really fun and also really challenging. In addition to all the other forms of marketing, right? Content, customer advocacy, outbound, paid media. I love it all. And then the other thing I do is I have a podcast. So GTM News. I'm actually doing an event in May on partnerships. So I do these events called the 9-9 series, where I get 9 practitioners. It's kind of a fast pace, like I call it the TikTok of B2B events, even though I have some strong feelings about TikTok from rotting our brains. But as far as the fast paced environment, so I'm doing an event in May. So go check out gtm.news. our website, and you can register for that event coming up here soon.
Awesome. Anywhere else they should go to find you other than gtm.news?
Yeah, you can check me out on LinkedIn. I post there consistently and love to connect, and I love to talk strategy too. So if you want to ping me with marketing questions, go-to-market partnership questions, I love to chat. Or you can follow me on there to kind of see what content I'm posting.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of Justin and myself, thank you so much for joining the show. This has been another episode of the Go-to-Market Cheat Code. If this is your first time listening, follow us, subscribe, hit that button, do all those cool things, leave us a review. We need that stuff to help spread the word. Follow Taylor at gtm.news and give him some love as well. Taylor, thank you again for joining the show.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. Super fun.